taking the time out today to join this webinar about understanding the impact of the two-child limit. It's really important to have these conversations, and we've got some great voices on today. Now, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Shabnam Mahmood. I'm originally from Yorkshire, as you can guess by the accent, but I live in London. I'm a journalist. I report for BBC News across all outlets like radio, TV, online, and I've covered a range of stories from light-hearted entertainment ones to more serious news ones. But I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to have been asked to chair this event. So straight away, let me tell you a little bit about the event. So this webinar is part of a research programme funded by the Nuffield Foundation, looking at experiences of welfare reform among larger families. Now, it focuses on the two-child limit and the benefit cap. And the research is a partnership between the Universities of York, Oxford and LSE and the fantastic charity that is Child Poverty Action Group. So let me bring in Ruth Patrick at this stage to tell you a little bit more. Over to you, Ruth.
Yeah, and thanks. And again, we're really pleased, Shabnam, that you were able to chair today. So thanks from all of us on behalf of the research team. So all I wanted to say was just a few kind of technicals about how we go about this. This is my first ever webinar that I'm actually responsible for the technicalities of. So anything that goes awfully wrong, you can like lay the blame at my door. It's absolutely fine. So, but hopefully nothing too bad will go wrong. But the main things, just in terms of the practicalities, are that we'll keep all the presentations like fairly short so that there'll be lots of time for questions. You can ask questions through the Q&A function in the chat, and then Shabnam will relay those questions back to the presenters. And do use that Q&A function for any comments as well, because it's a really nice place that we can kind of collate people's thoughts on the presentations. The other thing is that we are recording the webinar for those that kind of can't make it right here and now, but can kind of listen in on later. So just to be aware of that. And if anybody is up for tweeting as they listen, the hashtag for the event is larger families. So that's all I had technically. So I just hope it all goes well, and thanks for bearing with us if any of the technicalities don't work. Back to you, Shabnam.
Yeah, thank you for coming. So let's start today's webinar, Understanding the Impact of the Two-Child Limit. So our first speaker today is David Whithorn. David is a father of three who has been affected by the two-child limit. He's a member of the group You See Us, who have developed recommendations for what needs to change if universal credit is to become fit for purpose. Now, he shares some of his experiences with us and reflections on what needs to change and why. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much, Shabnam. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Yeah, as said before, married with three children, third being born in 2019, which obviously means we're affected by the two-child limit. Just a bit of background on myself, further background. I got my degree of ongoing mental health problems over the past sort of 10 years or so. Let's see, I've been in and out of jobs, therapies, hospitals, but I got through. I'm on the other side of that now. And like Shabnam was saying, I've been involved with the You See Us group over the past sort of 18 months. And yeah, I've got loads of information on that, but I try my best just to stick to the two-child limit and benefit cap experience. We had deductions for my wife's FE grant as she was starting her pathway to becoming a nurse. We've had advance repayments, debt repayments for tax credits, etc. Basically, universal credit has been a nightmare, one issue after another, and we're constantly anticipating that something's going to crop up. So we're hoping though we're over the worst of it and have some predictability now. Anyway, sort of on to the two-child limit and benefit cap. I'm focusing more on that. Or sorry, I should say before I move on that Ruth has the information there as well for the You See Us group, and I think the web address for that is www.ucus.org.uk. So if you're interested in that, you can find out more information there. So yeah, just the major impact that the two-child limit and benefit cap have had is debt. is the major one. And again, this is kind of tied in with the experience of universal credit. Basically, after becoming debt-free and getting rid of credit cards, we had to get another one because of universal credit, and then we now have two. It's not been a very good time. We're struggling at the moment to try and clear debts and so on before I'm starting my master's course. Another issue that caused that was universal credit auto setting repayments to the maximum level, and you would have thought it would have been lowered to the lowest possible repayment. Again, just sort of one of the problems with the welfare system. I guess it should really be a common sense approach. You know, you're dealing with people on the lowest incomes. Just skipping through some of my notes here because I don't want to focus too much on advances and all of that. Yeah, basically after 15 months of high repayments on advances and debts, we thought we finally had everything paid off, and they came up with another debt that we owed them, apparently, from tax credits of year gone by. Yeah, the impact it had on relationships. Me and my wife were separated there for a while and got back together. Thankfully, everything has worked out, but again, it's just the financial impact it has. Hand in hand with that, just the stress and the toll it took on our mental health. Yeah, it's mad. It's the sleepless nights, selling our belongings, things that we didn't really want to get rid of, but it was just to get some extra cash in and pay off debts. And as well, just the stress and comfort eating happened too. Yeah, the children missing out. We sacrifice at times to ensure they have the necessities. Other times they don't get the treats they deserve. Like birthday card money being needed to cover debts or put some electric in. That's just some of the experiences that we've had. We didn't plan our third child, but when we found out, we were expecting. Some of the so-called solutions that there are wasn't really an option to us. I was brought up Presbyterian church. My wife is LDS, and we're now both LDS, and it's just not an option, abortion or anything like that. And we certainly didn't want to give up the child. So, you know, what do you do? Of course, we were delighted to have our third child, Megan, and we were aware we wouldn't receive child tax credits at the time, but we weren't really aware that we would also be impacted by the benefit cap. You know, when you hear about the benefit cap, we were sort of under the impression that it's reserved for people that sort of take the mick, whether I'm speaking correctly here or not, and have large homes, big TVs, Sky Sports packages, and luxury holidays. But this just couldn't be further from the truth. We don't have much. Sorry, get a wee bit welled up talking about it. So what would have helped? I have noted better understanding or information to an extent of the benefit system and the impact that the third child would truly have. Though ultimately, as I've said before, we were unexpectedly pregnant, and it was never really an option to do anything else for us. This kind of leads on to another point which ties into the universal credit experience we've had. So in Northern Ireland specifically, they had a discretionary fund available, which was non-repayable, which you could have had part of instead of taking out the massive advances. But unfortunately, the staff that were dealing with us did not know anything about this. It was there and it wasn't being used. So we ended up with advances that we had to pay back over those 15 months when there would have been a discretionary fund or a grant available there that could have took some of that burden away. So yeah, better sort of information and staff being better informed. I find it hard to come up with more points on what would have helped other than, you know, if the two-child cap wasn't there at all. It just doesn't make sense to me. At the end of the day, we have 3 kids and the third child exists. Megan exists, whether the government acknowledges that or not. The other point I would make is just on the benefit cap. Surely it shouldn't be implemented where the two-child cap does exist, because it's double whammy. You know, I think we're only in these circumstances because my furlough pay isn't enough. So the other argument would be, is this fair? Because we've only recently been affected by the benefit cap. I'm also listed as limited capability for work due to my ongoing mental health problems, anxiety being the main one. I feel like I'm getting there with the depression somehow, with all this going on. So really, should the benefit cap also be applied in this case? You know, so I can't see how it's justified.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, for sharing your experiences with us. It's really hard to sometimes talk about things, especially on a public platform like this. And so thank you for sharing that with us. And there's a couple of messages that have come in. One from Marjorie Bahaj. To all panelists and attendees, David describing the debts that are not his, but a system failing him creating debts, a point I raised in the APPG poverty meetings. And then another comment is from Dave Beck. This story is so familiar to me personally, so thanks very much, David, as I have exactly the same story. I just seem to get myself and family out of poverty, then bang, HMRC seem to find another debt or repayment I owe. Another, Nicola Douglas says, thank you for sharing your story, David. Like all the rest of us, we want to thank you again. And Rachel Gregory says the Cabinet Office currently have a call for evidence open about fairness in government debt collection, which is an opportunity to raise problems with how debts are collected from UC. Now, there's a website linked to that. Dave Beck, one of my worst days was on my PhD graduation day. I was doing everything I was supposed to do in terms of meritocracy, and my research was on poverty and food bank use. Yet on my PhD graduation day, I returned home to find a bailiff at my door waiting to take £3,000 worth of belongings. I still had my bloody gown and cap on. So sad to hear these things. Elizabeth Whitehead, how easy did you feel it was to challenge the decisions taken on repayments and other decisions concerning your UC? That's to you, David.
Oh, that's been difficult. So I think it was April sort of 2018 I started my journey. That's actually a very, very good question. My wife then started her access course and she got an FE grant as part of that, and they were actually taking off more money than it was worth. We just found it impossible to live. It was very, very difficult. It's frustrating not being able to talk to a person. You're constantly referred to your online journal. You leave constant messages there, chasing that up. And we went through an appeals process and it was left with the decision maker for a very long time. It took, I think, 6 months from start to finish this. And in the end, they adjusted it. But as we found out last month, that they got that wrong as well. They actually owe us more money. So this whole time they've been taking too much money from us, and we've been struggling. So yeah, it's not been nice. I'm still going through it. you know, that's ongoing. So that answers your question. Really, it's been very, very difficult.
A really interesting question from Kathy Hamilton is, she says, if the second pregnancy is twins, does only one twin get benefit? And that's to everyone.
I think Tom, do you want to answer that? Tom?
Yeah, so I think Kitty's going to say a bit more about the policy, but yeah, there are various exemptions, and one of those is for multiple births. So yes, if you're third or fourth child are both twins, then you do still get benefits for the twin, but not for the other one.
Another question here. How easy did you feel it was to challenge the decisions taken on repayments and other decisions concerning your UC?
Sorry, is that for me? Sorry, couldn't hear you there.
Yeah, I think David,
Yeah.
they were just asking about how, like, the process of challenging decisions, like, did you find it easy to challenge, or was that quite a hard process to...
I think that was that not very similar to the question sort of before?
It's very similar to that question, yes.
Yeah.
Another comment here from Helen Crickard. Abortion is a personal choice or a decision, but for women and families in Northern Ireland, it is not a choice that could be accessed then and even now. It is not a pathway that can be accessed. We agree with that.
Yep.
And somebody has saying, Sarah Chapman saying, thanks so much, David. It's incredibly powerful hearing the impact of this policy on you and your family. Thank you for speaking up about it so incredibly well. Lots of praise for you, David. So much.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for the comments as well. And can we try and put any questions in the Q&A into a separate chat if possible? But thank you, David, for talking to us. We're going to move on now. We go over to two wonderful ladies, Ruth Patrick and Kitty Stewart. Let me just tell you a little bit about them. Ruth Patrick is a lecturer in social policy at the University of York. Her work examines the disconnect between popular and political narratives around poverty, welfare reform, and austerity, paying particular attention to the lived experiences of those directly affected by these institutions. And Kitty Stewart is an Associate Professor of Social Policy and Associate Director of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at LSE. Her research primarily focuses on the causes and consequences of child poverty and how policy alters these relationships. So hello, Ruth and Kitty.
Thank you. And just thank you from me as well to David for kind of starting us off. I think it was a really important presentation, and it's really hard to follow for lots of reasons, but mainly because you did such a good job. So thank you. Kitty, are you okay to share your screen? So what we wanted to do today is we're going to share some really early findings from the kind of Welfare Reform and Larger Families project that we're working on, that's been funded by Nuffield Foundation. But first, we just want to kind of contextualize that, and it's going to be like a flashback to Boris Johnson's press conference where they say next slide please, because Kitty's sharing the screen. So yeah, so I have to say that, but only for 2 slides because I'm only doing the opening bit. So just to start with saying kind of why larger families. So why did we kind of, when we developed and designed this research, why did we have this focus on larger families? And there were just a couple of kind of key things that we wanted to flag. And I think the first thing is just the fact and the extent to which kind of very simplified and stigmatized kind of representations of larger families have been a really kind of central and core part of kind of negative narratives and welfare that have kind of come to the fore and really sort of predominated over recent years. And obviously there's a much longer history of kind of larger families being associated with kind of negative characterizations, but increasingly in recent times being used to kind of defend that kind of anti-welfare sentiment, and that anti-welfare sentiment then kind of rolling up and kind of justifying particular policy agendas. So that was kind of a key starting point. And I think here the work of Tracy Jensen and Imogen Tyler is really important in their kind of representation of kind of benefit broods as a kind of who are then weaponized and used to defend particular policy approaches. But at the same time, and of course, like relatedly and probably not by accident, larger families have been really disproportionately affected by recent benefit changes. So they have seen, and Kitty's going to go on and talk about, even before the benefit cap and the 2-child limit took effect, how larger families were already at really disproportionate risk of poverty. But at the same time, and this was why we kind of felt it was an important agenda to pursue, larger families haven't been a particular focus of recent social policy research for quite some time. So we have the really important kind of historical work of people like Hilary Land going really far back, but more recently, but still in early 2000s, work for Joseph Rowntree Foundation by Jonathan Bradshaw and colleagues. Next slide, please, Kitty. Thank you.
Oh, I've gone too far.
Oh, gone
Sorry.
too. No, it's okay. So just the only other thing we wanted to say then, so that's kind of why larger families, but just to kind of introduce the research program that Kitty, Erin and I are working on. It's a 3-year research program of mixed methods research, and we're really grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for funding us. Importantly, it's mixed methods, which I think all 3 of us are really excited about, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of combine the best of kind of quantitative and qualitative analysis to actually understand how larger families, like risks and experiences of poverty, have been affected by the 2 policies that we're most kind of focusing on, which is the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. And the quantitative work will be led by Kitty and Erin, and then I'm kind of leading, I guess, on the qualitative longitudinal work, which is going to be following a small number of families in Bradford, which is Shabnam and mine's hometown, but also in London, where Shabnam, you now live, so you've got a foot in both camps. But yeah, so looking at how those families have been affected by the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. Importantly, and I think I speak for the whole team in saying this is important to all of us, it will include a participatory element, and that will make sure that we really draw on the expertise of family members themselves and people like David, so that the recommendations for change we make are rooted in those experiences. And I'm really pleased that David is on our advisory group as well. And we're working in partnership with the Child Poverty Action Group, who will help us in terms of the development and actually kind of lobbying of policymakers around our policy recommendations. And we've just put up on that slide the website where you can see more about the project. So now I'm going to hand over to Kitty, who's going to talk about the research in more detail.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. So just briefly, when we're talking about welfare reform, we thought we ought to just highlight, as many of you will know, that there has been a whole range of different cuts and reforms to the benefit system going back to 2011, targeted not specifically at large families, but including large families, among others. So lots of different cuts affecting working age families with children in general. And I won't run through those, but there's a list there. Our project is particularly interested in the 2 policies that have targeted large families, but we're looking at that in the context of all these other reforms that are taking place. And those 2 policies are, as Ruth has highlighted, first of all, the benefit cap, which puts an overall limit on the amount a family can receive in benefits, £20,000 now, or 23,000 in London. And the focus of today's webinar, which is the 2-child limit. So many of you will know what that is, but just to be absolutely clear, this is a policy that restricts support for families, child contingent support through child tax credit and universal credit, to the first 2 children in the family only. After a sort of late change to the way the policy was, they decided to implement the policy, this only affects 3rd and subsequent children who were born from April 2017 onwards. So we've heard from David, so his daughter Megan, born in 2019, was affected. If you had a 3rd child already born before 2015, before 2017, you would still be receiving benefits for them. So that's important to be aware, because what that means is that the policy is only slowly going to show up in the kind of national data on poverty and so on, because it's only affecting very, very young children at this point. But gradually over time, it will stretch until it affects all larger families who receive those benefits. And we've already had a question in the chat about this. There are some exemptions. So multiple births, if your 2nd child is twins, then you receive benefit for both of those children. And there are also exemptions for children in care and for children who are conceived as a result of coercion, which is a very pleasant exemption, and it sort of underlines what the logic, the policy logic behind this is about, trying to make families take control and make decisions about the number of children that they can afford. So exemptions if it's multiple birth, if it was coercion, then, you know, the mother didn't mean to do that. That wasn't a decision they were making. So here's the kind of policy logic, which raises all sorts of questions, but just so that people are clear, if people are asking why on earth did they think about introducing such a policy, the logic put forward was that families in receipt of benefits should, quote, face the same financial choices about having children as those supporting themselves solely through work. So the idea broadly that you shouldn't have more than 2 children unless you can afford them. So that's the policy that we're talking about. And I want to do 2 things really in my time here. The first is to just set some context by looking at who larger families in the UK are. So who are these families that have 3 or more children? Who is this policy likely to be affecting? And secondly, start to look at what's been happening to their poverty rates. And as I've said, this policy itself isn't starting to really affect poverty yet, but we can see the context in which it's being introduced and how other welfare reforms have affected poverty for larger families. So just to clarify, in all the graphs I'm going to show you, larger families are families with 3 or more children, so those affected by the policy, and smaller families have 1 or 2 children. And all the graphs are take the child as the unit of analysis. So that means that we're looking at, for example, the percentage of children who live in a larger family, or the percentage of children who live in poverty, rather than the families themselves. And this is all data from the Family Resources Survey, and the latest data is for 2018-19. So again, most families not yet affected by the policy. So to start off, first of all, how many children does this actually affect? So this shows us the percentage, the blue line is the percentage of children who live in families where there are 3 or more children. And you can see that it's now around 31% in the last year that we've got data for, and that represents a bit of a decline and then a rise in the most recent years. The overwhelming majority of children in large families live in a family which has 3 children and not more than 3 children. So you can see that only 10% of children overall live in a family with 4 or more, and just a few percent 5 or more. So about 3/4 of larger families are families with 3 children, not more. I was going to ask you what you thought first about this. What if you thought to yourself, is this more likely to be, is a large family more common among a lone parent family or a couple family? I don't know what people's prior assumption might be. In fact, when we look at the data, there's absolutely no difference. So this shows us the percentage of children who live with a lone parent, and the blue line is all children, and the dotted red line is children in large families, and the green children in small families. So it's about somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 children now live in a lone parent family, and it's exactly the same percentage whether you're looking at small or large families. The small family line sort of chops up and down a little bit. That just represents small sample sizes in the data, but you can see that the overall trend is very, very similar there. We do see differences by parents' level of education. So it's a bit, children are a little bit more likely to live in a large family if their parents have lower levels of education. So what we see here is about 28% of children who live with a household head who is a postgraduate live in a larger family. Not much different from below degree or A-level. If you live with a household head whose highest qualification is O-levels, more like 1/3 of children in those households will be in a larger family. And my thing is blocking out. I don't know if that's true for you too. My faces are blocking out these last bits, but now I can see them. Much higher levels among those who have any other qualifications, which tends to mean overseas qualifications. So that's a sort of indicator that the parents come from overseas and are migrants, or no qualifications at all. So nearly half of children in those households live in larger families. So there are these differences by education, but we shouldn't exaggerate how great those are. It's still the case that across the educational spectrum, if you like, this is a choice. Having a larger family is a choice that's made by parents with very different levels of education. So 29% of all the children in large families live in a household where a graduate or postgraduate is the household head, compared to 25% who live in a household with below O-level or no qualifications. Differences by ethnicity are larger than those by education. So what we see here is the share of children who live in a large family is greater in Bangladeshi and Pakistani and black households, than in those with white households, in white households. So it's something like, it's more than half, 50 to 60% in Bangladeshi and Pakistani households. And again, these lines are a little bit choppy because of sample sizes. So we can't read too much into the trends, but you can see that broadly it looks like the share of children living in large families falling over time in Bangladeshi and Pakistani households. It's becoming a bit less common, whereas in black households it's becoming a little bit more common. Now, this is really important, of course, for the context for the two-child limit, because it tells us that some families by ethnicity are going to be much more likely to be affected by this policy than others because of patterns and norms about family size in different ethnic groups. And I saw that a question was raised in the chat also about religion. There are also going to be some religious groups that are also going to be more likely to be affected. Unfortunately, that's not something we can look at in this particular data set. Nonetheless, the majority of children in large families do live in white households. So this shows us the share of all children in large families by ethnic group, and the white majority is not shown. So by the end of the period, it's about 75% of all children in large families are in white families. And that is slowly shrinking over time, as partly because of the growing number of children overall in different ethnic, from different ethnic backgrounds. So you can see some increases in the share who are from black or Pakistani families, but still those are relatively small, 7 to 8% of the total each overall. Let's look now at employment patterns. So what are the patterns of employment among larger families? And this shows us, first of all, among couples. So couples who have children who live with couples in larger households. What are their parents, what pattern are their parents working? And you can see there that the most common pattern for parents is having one person working full-time and one at home. That's the yellow line. One full-time and one part-time is the second most common. And I want to draw your attention to the red line, which is no paid work. You can see that that's falling steadily over time to become the least most common pattern. And correspondingly, we're seeing a rise in the share of parents who are both working full-time, but that's still relatively small. It's only about 13% of families have that pattern. If we compare that to smaller families, that's quite interesting. And so here we have the graph on the right for the smaller families. And you can see that there, the most common pattern is one full-time and one part-time, but the share of smaller families where both parents are working full-time is rising rapidly. And it's now nearly 30% of households have that pattern. And that's really interesting because it tells us something about what the norms are. So we think about poverty as being a relative concept, and it matters what other families have. So if in smaller families the norm is for both parents to be working full-time, that in itself pushes up the poverty line, and it makes it more difficult for larger families who have a lower work intensity to keep up with that, even before we start thinking about the social security system. It's a point that's often made with in relation to lone parents. So as more and more families have two parents working full time, it's harder for lone parents to keep up, if you like. But it's also true when we're thinking about larger families, given that although patterns of work are changing, that pattern of having two parents working full time is still far less common for reasons we can all probably understand. I need to speed up a little bit, I think, but this shows us just the same figure, but for lone parents. And again, we've got larger families on the left, smaller families on the right. And again, I want to draw your attention to the fact that although having a lone parent at home is the most common pattern in a larger family with a lone parent, that is declining rapidly over time. And one thing that's interesting about these, it's almost like the smaller families you see the trend 20 years on after for the larger families. It's almost like this is the same graph, and we're seeing norms change over time. So again, this is really important context, because what we're not seeing here, if you think about the logic of both these policies, the benefit cap, the 2-child limit, emphasizing a sort of distinction between people who are working and people who aren't working. What we're not seeing here is a real kind of static problem that families aren't working. Families aren't working. This is changing over time for all sorts of reasons that I don't have time to go into now. But this it's being brought in a context where employment patterns are increasing. So now I just want to say a bit about the changing poverty risk facing large families in the UK. This shows us child poverty against a relative poverty line, and the red dots are the larger families. And you can see, well, that the story of changing child poverty in the UK over the last 20 years is really a story about larger families and not about smaller families, which is the green line, and shows much less change over time. So we can see that coming down pretty steadily, apart from just before the financial crisis, you get this rise here, coming down pretty steadily up until about 2012-13, and then very sharp increases since then. And again, remember that this is before really we see the 2-child limit come into play. We're already seeing this big rise linked to many of the other welfare reforms that I talked about briefly at the beginning. Against that was a relative line. We can do this against a fixed income poverty line, which stays the same in real terms over time, so it doesn't change with the changing median income level. And here you can see that there's been no change really over time over the last decade. So this is a line that we expect to see falling over time if families at the bottom are enjoying any sort of income growth. We would see this falling, and we're seeing this pretty static for the larger families, whilst falling a little bit for the small families, and some sign at the end that it may be starting to rise. The problem with these measures that I've showed you so far is they just show us a sort of head count, who falls below a particular given poverty line. And the problem with that is, well, it doesn't capture what happens to a family who's already below the poverty line and things have got worse for them as a result of change over time. And I'll show you briefly two figures which pick up what's happening to people below the line. This one shows the percentage of children falling below a combined low income and material deprivation threshold. So below 50% of relative income and unable to afford a certain number of set items, for example, having friends round to tea, having a celebration at birthdays. And you can see again for large families that this is rising over time. And we can also see that the poverty gap, some signs that that's also starting to rise. So that's the average amount by which a family below the poverty line falls below the line. It's actually larger for small families than for large families, but both growing. Okay, so finally, I just want to make sure I have time to show you these graphs, which show us what's happening to poverty by the work status of the parents. And so we've got larger families and smaller families, and you can see the difference between families who have no one in paid work at the top there in yellow, and families at the bottom in blue who have all both parents in paid work, or a lone parent in paid work. And you can see the really dramatic changes that have been taking place for families where no one works, both this really big drop over time to 2012 and then the very sharp increase. But for other household types, for anyone who's in work, we're seeing very different patterns. There's really been no change or even a worsening situation among families who are in full-time work and who are in part-time work, the green line. So when I showed you that for larger families, poverty was improving until 2012 or 13, you can now see that all of that change is taking place for families where no one's working, or it's taking place because people are moving across categories and they're moving from out of work into paid work. For among those who are working, things were not getting better for much of this period, and now are getting worse sharply. So this yellow line, I think, really shows us how important the social security system is in driving levels of poverty among people who are not working. But these patterns also show us a more complicated story that's taking place, and that we need to unpick and understand that despite these changes in social security, and despite some improvements over a lot of this earlier period, that wasn't having an effect in terms of overall poverty rates. And finally, if we look at this against a fixed income, we see the same sort of thing. So if you focus on these, the blue lines, the families who were in both parents in paid work, you've seen no change for nearly 20 years in the share of larger families who are living below this, below the poverty line, measured in this quite conservative sort of way. So this is a poverty line that stays the same in real terms over time. Okay, just to sum up briefly, because I think I'm running out of my time zone. What have we learned that's relevant to understanding the two-child limit that's coming in just at the end of this period? So firstly, living in a larger family is pretty common. It's more likely in households with lower levels of education, and much more likely among some minority ethnic groups. So we know that the impact's going to fall unevenly on household types. And we also know that parents are spending increasingly more time in paid work, but parents in larger families still don't have the same work intensity rates as smaller families. So there's this double pressure on poverty rates in these families. They've got higher needs, more mouths to feed, and they've got relatively lower work income. And it's kind of obvious when you think about it, but I think it's really important to have both those things in mind, that the social security system has a sort of double effort to make. And we know how important social security benefits have been, both in reducing poverty rates when things were improving, and now in driving higher levels of poverty even before the two-child limit takes effect. And we also know that there's a real problem here, that among larger working families, poverty has been steadily rising. And so there's something here that needs fixing and thinking about, and we can be pretty sure that a two-child limit is going to do the opposite of helping. So what's next for our project? We're going to do a bit more work kind of unpicking some of these relationships between employment patterns and social security support, and what's happening to the poverty line, to better understand how the expansion and then cuts of social security have affected the risk of poverty in larger families. And then we've got these other two strands that we're starting to work on that Ruth referred to at the beginning. So one is using quasi-experimental techniques and big data to explore the impact of the two-child limit and the benefit cap on various indicators of family well-being. And the second is to start our longitudinal qualitative research, talking to affected families about their experiences and decision making. So we hope to have more to say about that further down the line. But Camilla and Tom's work that's been done to date is going to be able to speak much more to the impact so far. That's it.
Thank you, Kitty. Thank you, Ruth, earlier on. Thank you, Kitty. Lots of interesting data there, and lots to take in as well. So, can we get some questions in? And first of all, I'd just like to ask you, Kitty, what surprised you most about these findings?
I think I was surprised by the extent to which, I knew that larger families are at higher risk, but the extent to which all of the changes in child poverty that we know about already, both the improvements under Labour governments and then the kind of deterioration since about 2012, is really a story about larger families. I don't think I'd realised that to that extent. And I was also interested by the work patterns, which again, I kind of had some sense of that, but I think the extent to which both employment is increasing among both household types, alongside poverty getting worse within each of those categories in the most recent years, I think also struck me.
Okay, so we've got 94 participants on here, so thank you everyone for bearing with us. I've got a question here from Rebecca Spillin. I hope I've pronounced that right. As families from ethnic minority backgrounds are more likely to have more larger families, do you consider the 2-child limit to be discriminatory, or at least out of line with the principles of the Equality Act? How can this be challenged?
I was gonna, if I can come in on that one, it was just to say that there are various legal challenges ongoing, and I know actually the Just Fair Coalition have published something quite recently about why they think the 2-child limit does contravene the Equality Act. But I think Lizzie, who's with us from CPAG, she could just speak briefly to update on the legal challenges. So Lizzie, do you want to come in?
Yep, hello everyone. So CPAG does have a legal challenge to the 2-child limit. It's going to be heard in the Supreme Court from the 20th to the 22nd of October. We think that the 2-child limit unlawfully discriminates against a number of different groups, including children with multiple siblings, large families, and those with a religious or moral objection to the use of birth control, which has been raised already. We had a sort of partial the original challenge in the High Court was allowed in part. So there were some changes made after our first challenge in the High Court to do with the order of that children arrive, if it involves kinship carers, and that was then later extended to adopted children as well. So it sort of had a partial success, but we'll be back in court on the 20th of October.
Okay. And another question here. This is something that I know comes up in terms of a number of communities, including my own, the Jewish community for the strictly Orthodox, where not only is abortion not really an option, but often many forms of contraception are not either. Doesn't this mean that the 2-child cap actually breaches equality legislation because it puts members of various religions at a disadvantage which they cannot avoid?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good, it's a fair point. And I think it's probably, I mean, Tom, who's, our next speaker comes from the Church of England. And I think there's been quite a lot of sort of multi-faith activity around the All Kids Count Coalition, which is a kind of coalition of charities and campaign groups. And I think there's really good religious representation on that as well.
Another question here that says, and this is for you probably, Kitty, does your study include the effect that numerous different council tax support schemes have on the larger family and their ability to pay?
No, yes, it does, because it does in the sense that we're looking at the effect of income after taxes are paid and after housing costs. But we're not picking, but I mean, and that's a really important point, that comes on top of, and some councils are doing better than others at not applying the 2-child limit. So that's, many councils include that in their calculations of council tax benefits. So yeah, it's an important point.
Okay, there's lots of messages coming in on this subject. Is there any evidence from trends in registration of births data about whether the number of births has changed since 2017? And that's from Lavinia Mitten from the University of Kent.
Well, that's I mean, in fact, we were just talking about that a few days ago, about doing some work to pick up on that. When you looked at the figure that I presented at the beginning, you certainly don't see any sign that this is affecting fertility so far, and that's something we want to pick up in, possibly in the quantitative work, but certainly also in the qualitative work, talking to families about whether did they know about the policy, did they factor that into their decision making. That's something that certainly, that's one of the government's intentions, is that people won't have these babies that they quote unquote can't afford. I must say it's very upsetting and distressing. I found it very upsetting to hear David talking about, I mean, that someone should feel they need to justify, that abortion wasn't a choice for them, I think is, quite shocking. And I think and I can see some messages coming up in the questions also saying that people are having abortions for this reason, and I think that is, you know, something that I think all of us can agree is a terrible thing.
Can I? Tom just wanted to come in. Is that, yeah? Tom, go. Tom.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know about the impact on the birth rate. We have been monitoring the government's abortion statistics, which are published annually, and we've specifically asked them to provide a more detailed breakdown by the number of abortions according to the number of prior births of the mother. And there's been a really kind of worrying trend over the last 10 years. Whereby there's been over 30% increase in the number of abortions in the UK amongst mothers with 2 or more previous live births, whereas the number of abortions for mothers with no previous births is pretty flat. So something is going on whereby there's been a very large increase in abortions amongst those families that are most affected, not just by the 2-child limit, because actually this trend increase predates the 2-child limit, but I think the accumulation of all of the kind of welfare cuts that have disproportionately impacted larger families. So that is something that we're looking at, and we are quite concerned about it.
Can I just suggest that we move to Tom and Camilla's presentation just for time, and then we can kind of, because I want to give, it's always the third, yeah, because you guys have got really important things to say, and then we can always come back if we've got time for questions, and also I'll take a note of all the questions and we can kind of follow them up afterwards. So okay,
good idea. So we move on to our third presentation. This one is with Tom Sefton and Camilla Mcartney. So let me tell you a little bit about them. Tom Sefton is the Economics and Social Policy Advisor at Church of England. He leads a broad remit of work examining the drivers of poverty in the UK. And Camilla Mcartney is an engagement officer for the Leeds Social Sciences Institute at the University of Leeds. She's deeply involved in supporting the policy and public engagement, and her research is focused on child and family poverty. So over to you, Tom and Camilla.
Tom, I think you might be on mute.
okay.
Sorry, I'll start again. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Yeah, we're going to do a joint presentation today. I'm basically going to cover the numbers bit, and Camilla's going to talk about some of the stories from the research that we've been doing. Oh, sorry, my screen's not working. So I'm trying to move to the next slide. I'll give it another go. Sorry about this.
No, it's okay.
Slideshow from the beginning. No. Sorry. Sorry about this.
Tom, oops. If it's easier, email it to me or Camilla, you know, and we could do that. We can go back to being Boris Johnson press conference style. And is it working?
Yeah, no, it's obviously sharing, but it's not going through the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, I will. Sorry about this. It was working earlier. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
Slideshow. On the current slide. No. Okay. Okay, we might have to work with that screen. Sorry about that. So yeah, so the work that we're presenting today is a joint piece of research. It's a kind of ongoing project with mainly between the Church of England and the Child Poverty Action Group, monitoring the impact of the 2-child limit. But also we've been working closely with other organisations, particularly Leeds University on some qual research that Camilla will be talking about, but also other organisations like Women's Aid, Turn to Us, the Refugee Council and the Nuffield Foundation. And this research is part of a much broader campaign to lift the two-child limit with various strands. So part of the work is about filling the evidence gap on the policy's impact, and that's obviously what we're going to be talking about today. And crucially, making sure that we listen to people who've been directly affected by the policy, like David. Alongside that, we've also been coordinating a cross-party group of MPs and peers led by the Bishop of Durham and also by Alison Thulis, an SNP MP, trying to build parliamentary support for lifting the two-child limit. And then alongside this, CPAG have been building an alliance of faith and charitable organisations who are opposed to the policy. So that's just to set this in context. In terms of the research I'm going to be talking about today, it's basically got three bits of work to it. So one is an online survey of over 1,000 families, like David, who've been directly affected by the two-child limit. A bit more on that later. Secondly, some in-depth qualitative interviews with 16 families, which Camilla will be talking about. And then thirdly, we've been collating a whole bunch of other data and evidence from freedom of information requests and from various government and academic reports. So I'm going to go through some of the evidence that we've kind of picked up from all of that work over the last couple of years. So firstly, looking at the kind of overall impact so far. So as Kitty said, this is a policy that builds over time. It only affects families who've got a third or subsequent child born after April 2017. So the latest figures, which you've got here, show that as of April, which is when the government published their latest figures, 240,000 families have been affected by the policy. Since then, we estimate that about 60,000 families have been newly affected as a result of making a new claim for UC during the lockdown. So that's from around the middle of March to the end of June, when UC claims started to return to pre-COVID levels. And then on top of that, every week, over 200 families are newly affected by the limit as children are born into families with 2 or more children. If you add all of that together, by September, we estimate that about 330,000 families have now been affected. And within those families, 1.1 million children are affected. And over time, by the end of the Parliament, we're expecting that number to double to over 600,000 families and over 2 million children. Now, this is going to affect children and families in every constituency across the country, but it will, as Kitty implied earlier, have a disproportionate effect on certain groups of families and particularly certain communities. I don't think you can see the final column, unfortunately. This is a list of the constituencies that are most affected by the two-child limit. And these are estimates for April 2024. So by the end of this Parliament, and these are numbers that we presented to all of these MPs, this is an estimate of how many families and children we think are going to be affected by the policy by the end of the Parliament. And you can see that in the worst affected areas, a third or more of all children in these areas are going to be hit by the two-child limit. And one of the reasons for this, which has already come up in the chat, is of course the disproportionate impact that this policy has on particular faith groups. So I've highlighted here the impact on Muslim and Jewish families, particularly. So 60% of children in Muslim families live in larger families, and that's about double the national rate. So that's obviously going to impact on areas where there is a high concentration of Muslim families. Now, we know that the majority of these families are low-income working families who are already living in or close to the poverty line. And research has shown very clearly that this policy is the single most important driver of rising child poverty over the next 5 years or so. Now, Kitty's given us some useful kind of context showing how the poverty figures have looked over the last 10 years. This is kind of looking forward and projecting the impact. And what you can see is that by the end of 2024, according to the Resolution Foundation, more than half of families with 3 children are likely to be in poverty, and 2/3 of families with 4 or more children are likely to be in poverty. And the 2-child limit is one of the main reasons for this. What that graph doesn't show is that the main impact of the policy is not so much to push more families into poverty, but to push families who are already in poverty even deeper into poverty. So the CPAG have forecast that by 2024, around 300,000 children are likely to be pushed into poverty as a result of this policy. But 1 million children who are already in poverty will be pushed even deeper into poverty. And we've done some calculations to a kind of illustrative example of how this policy and other welfare cuts will affect a couple with a workless couple with 3 children. And what you can hopefully see, I don't know, I think the final column is a little bit cut off, is the cumulative effect of all of the cuts over the last 10 years is to reduce the income of this family by £100 a week, or over £5,000 a year, if you include deductions to council tax and so on. And more than half of this cut, about £53 a week, is due to the 2-child limit. What you can also see in the bottom row is that these families like this were already living in poverty before the 2-child limit and the other welfare cuts came into effect. So about 15% below the poverty line in 2010-11. By 2019-20, they're about 40% below the poverty line. So real concern about not just the numbers going into poverty, but the increase in the depth of poverty amongst families affected by this policy. Now, before I hand over to Camilla to talk about the findings from the qualitative research, I just wanted to very briefly say a few words about the online survey that we used to collect data on the impact of the policy. Now, we worked via the Entitled To website, which is an online benefit calculator that people use to check their entitlement to various benefits. And we found this to be a really effective way of identifying people who are likely to be affected by the 2-child limit, who are then invited to complete a short online survey. We started collecting responses in February 2019, and we now have over 1,300 responses. Now, this data obviously isn't as detailed as the kind of data that Kitty and others will be analysing, but it does have the advantage that it's very current. So we can put out the survey on SurveyMonkey and we can get responses in straight away. We've asked questions about the impact of the policy, obviously, on people's ability to afford basic living costs. We've also asked questions about their knowledge of the policy, which is pretty low. But actually the main benefit of the survey has been collecting stories of how families are being affected by the policy through an open-ended question in that survey. And we've also used the survey to recruit parents who were willing to take part in the qualitative element of the research, which I'm going to hand over to Camilla to talk about. Camilla, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen now. So hopefully you're okay to see this. And hopefully I'm able to move. That's brilliant. So thank you so much, Tom, for that. And thank you again to to Ruth for inviting me along to this webinar, and importantly as well to David for the insights it's given into his experience. Yes, so I like to start with this quote here, which hopefully you can see. I can only see myself. We are struggling, I won't lie, I've contemplated suicide. So this is just one of the many desperate quotes that I heard on the phone when collecting the stories of families affected by the 2-child limit, which I'm sure you'll agree is really heartbreaking. Sorry about that, feeling that would happen. If I wasn't doing this talk behind a screen and I could see all of your faces rather than my own and the mess that is my spare room, I'd ask what your motivations were for coming along to the seminar. And assuming and hoping that you weren't forced here against your will, I'm going to guess that you're here because ultimately you want to understand more about the experiences and the barriers facing disadvantaged children and families, and in the hope of wanting to do something in your various capacities to help with that. In fact, I'm just going to, sorry about this, I'm just going to change this so that it's not jumping around. Hopefully you can all see that still. As I've already introduced, I worked as a researcher on the 2-child limit project with the Church of England and the Child Poverty Action Group last year, conducting phone interviews as part of this wider project that Tom's just mentioned to understand the stories behind the facts and figures that we've heard. So I'm going to be spending the next 5 to 10 minutes, or maybe a little bit shorter, presenting to the qualitative findings of this report to highlight the devastating impact that the policy was having on families then. And owing to time constraints, it'll be quite a whistle-stop tour, and I encourage you to read the full report for further detail on that, as there's parts that I won't be able to cover in this time. And then I'll briefly hand back to Tom to close with some comments about how COVID might have exacerbated this situation for many. So before I begin talking about the findings of the report, I just thought it would be useful to briefly start out the questions that we asked so that you have an understanding of what we asked the families that we spoke to. So in my short presentation, I'll be providing an insight into the responses to the 2 questions highlighted in blue. So how has your financial situation changed since having your youngest, and how has the 2-child limit affected you and your family, but with an emphasis on the latter of those. And as Tom mentioned, we conducted 16 in-depth interviews between mid-February and mid-June last year. So I opened with a quote from one of the parents we spoke to who spoke of the desperation that they faced then and are very likely continuing to face now in light of the COVID situation. So this phrase here, knife-edge existence, was another way which kind of the scary and precarious experience of a life impacted by the 2-child limit was described by a number of respondents. It was a strong feeling that continued to cut through conversations that I had with family members, and it was really distressing to hear in the phone interviews that I conducted. So to this end, and as a way of placing the voice of those who I spoke to and who aren't able to be here at the heart of the presentation, I want to kind of extend this metaphor of a knife-edge existence and spend the next 5 or so minutes telling the story of the policy knife, as I've referred to it, and the financial and non-financial impacts that this is having on the families I spoke to. So before beginning this story with the only table of my presentation, I thought it would be helpful to have a visual of to set the tone of the sorts of basic essentials and the financial impact that this limit was having on families that we spoke to. So the following few slides will give a bit more of an in-depth insight into the ways in which the families were experiencing these financial cuts, but just to give an idea with those bars there on what sorts of things were being affected in terms of spending. So back to my story. As Thomas mentioned, the financial impact on families affected by the limit has been huge and far-reaching. An image of this hardship exacerbated by the child limit, or the policy knife as I'm referring to it, forcing families to cut back and cut into the very bare bones of spending, was conjured up when I asked this question about financial impact. The policy knife has sliced away at and cut so deeply into family budgets that the parents who spoke to were, as you'll be able to see with the quotes here, unable to afford the essentials such as food, heating, rent, and even medication as well, as you'll be able to see with the last quote, which I won't read out for the sake of time. So you can really see that this impact of the two-child limit and this idea of cutting into spending is particularly pertinent for the idea of being able to afford basic essentials. And you can kind of envision it kind of cutting away at, at meal times, or cutting the energy supply, leaving families with no gas and electric. Not only was the policy knife forcing families to go without, but it was forcing them to buy lower quality goods and unable to buy fresh and healthy food for their children. So lots of parents that I spoke to talked about buying worn out clothes and second-hand clothes from charity shops for their children, as this was all that they could afford. And even with all of this cutting back, families were still left in a situation of constant juggling and budgeting, despite which they were usually still left short and unable to pay bills, which kind of speaks to the points that David was making earlier. On the note of children, because that was something that parents mentioned, that they recognised that as children got older and grew up, that their expenses would become more and more problematic. Families talked about how the policy knife had cut away opportunities for their children, as these quotes here reveal. So they talked about not being able to go on school trips or being able to pay for extracurricular activities, and they were just things that parents referred to as a normal life, and they felt that the policy was kind of slicing away these educational and extracurricular activities and opportunities for their children. So some families spoke about the ways in which they tried to cope alongside these blows of the policy knife. So they talked about reliance on help from the family. This first quote here: "There was a point I didn't even have enough money in my bank account, and I had to ring my dad and say, 'Can you come up to my house and give me £5 so I can buy electric?' My father would come and take me shopping, or my uncle would come up and put petrol in my car." And the idea also around borrowing and credit cards, and with loans as well, high interest loans at that. These were some of the other ways that families were trying to survive the last days before the money came through, or for kind of unexpected essentials that they needed to buy. So as you can kind of understand from this, families were barely getting by, and having to rely on family members if they could. There was this real sense of feeling trapped, and just a constant cycle of shortfalls and no obvious way out, which was really disheartening and really heartbreaking to hear. Just hurrying along for the sake of time, sorry about this. So the financial hardship that the families we spoke to not only highlighted where literal cuts to spending had taken place, but with this idea of the policy knife, it had sliced away good quality food options for families, cut off electric. But this second part of the presentation, which I'll try and move through quickly, talks about perhaps the less obvious and less visible cuts that the families experienced. So as you'll see here from the quotes, feelings of shame, embarrassment and guilt were interwoven through every story that I heard from the families that we spoke to. Parents felt extremely ashamed not being able to provide for their children, or having to ask family and friends for help, and not being able to pay bills themselves. They just really felt, the parents, that they'd let their children down, and felt embarrassed that others might look down on them. Parents reported a real sense of guilt because they knew that the children were missing out, whether that be on healthy food or activities that they used to do. So for families where their two children prior to having their third were that little bit older, they talked about how they had to kind of stop having their extracurricular activities, and the parents really desperately wished that they could give their children more. That was something that came through so strongly. Interestingly, also some parents talked about how they felt cut off and excluded themselves by the financial situation. So they found it difficult to see their friends or family on social media going out and socialising when they knew that they couldn't afford to take part. And it's likely that this isolation obviously would compound the stress and anxiety that parents were already experiencing. As David spoke about in the beginning, the policy knife kind of cut through to let people's levels of stress, anxiety, mental health, it was having a profoundly negative impact on the well-being of both parents and children, as per the stories that I heard. The majority of people we spoke to reported living with constant stress and anxiety, as you'll be able to see in some of the emboldened words here in these quotes. Ideas about suicide, turmoil, things being absolutely awful, and constant worry. The policy knife wasn't only cutting away at the ability to buy essentials, but it also, families also spoke about how the relationships were being cut and severed by this, as the following quote, or the following quotes, should I say, exemplify. So families talk about not being able to enjoy moments like Christmas, about children themselves experiencing distress, and parent-child relationships being severed by the financial restraints, and then between siblings also, which was perhaps the most heartbreaking of the stories that I heard. These last two quotes here, well, the third one in particular, where one of the parents was talking about how their eldest child resented the fact that they had a younger sibling, which had caused this financial situation. So just finally looking to the future, in this context, the two-child limit makes a significant difference to families' financial situation and quality of life. We sought to isolate the impact of families' wider financial situation by asking respondents how an extra £230 a month or £53 a week would change the situation. And all felt, as these quotes highlight, that this was a significant amount of money which would improve life for the family. Some mentioned being able to put some money aside for emergencies and to avoid getting into further debt. But I think the images and the feelings that came through really strongly from this was that they just felt that it would provide that sense of freedom and just an escape from the constant worries that they were experiencing. So I'll now pass back to my colleague Tom to close with some comments about how COVID might have exacerbated this already difficult situation for the families that we spoke to.
Thanks, Camilla. So just okay, I just want to finish really briefly just by talking about the implications of COVID-19. I think one of the things that really struck me from the interviews that we carried out with families was how unpredictable life is and how all sorts of things can happen that can affect not just the financial, but particularly the financial situation of families, whether that's family breakdown, whether that's unemployment, poor health, unexpected pregnancies, like David talks about. And I think what COVID has done is really just exposed the flaw in the very simplistic view that government have about family planning, this idea that people can make a kind of economically rational choice about whether they can afford to have a third child and whether they can guarantee the financial security of their family over the next 18 years. I think what COVID has shown is that people can't even predict what their situation is going to be like in the next month or two, let alone the next 18 years. So it's really just kind of highlighted something that we felt was already there. I think it's also brought in a huge number of families. So we reckon about 60,000 families who've been newly affected as a result. Many of those families who were previously on a much higher income and are almost brand new to the system. So I guess what we're hoping might come out of this, if there's anything good that can come out of it, is a kind of deeper appreciation of the inadequacy of the current system, but also the need for a kind of social insurance model of the welfare system that kind of protects people against these kind of unexpected life events.
Thank you.
That's a summary, but yeah, I'll leave some time for questions.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Camilla, as well. Some really good points raised there in your research, and some really heartbreaking and poignant stuff that's come out of there on the financial hardships that are faced by families. So I'll get to a couple of quick questions. there's lots of questions. Does the 2-child limit impact on people's behaviour in forming new households that would be larger because they include stepchildren? Question there. Hello?
Who wants to take that? Just to say, so on the questions, we're kind of slightly run out of time now. So I mean, we will, but if we take like a couple of questions from you, Shabnam, and then we'll sort of wrap up. But what we'll also do is, I'm just kind of committing us all as panelists, but we can maybe look at what questions were outstanding and then do some written responses that we'll send around by email. On that question, I don't know if anyone else wants to come in. We haven't obviously done the qualitative longitudinal work yet, but I think there is kind of, obviously it's really possible, isn't it, that is a factor in terms of how people make decision making around the formation of new families, and definitely that could potentially, obviously from a kind of cost point of view, it could cost the government more money if they've got to support 2 separate households rather than 1 blended household. Did anyone want to come in and add anything else to that? Just nod or
that just echoes some of the conversations I had with the families whereby they had stepchildren or there were step parents involved, and the difficulty in trying to bring a family together under these circumstances, and just exacerbating an already impossible situation. I think there was one family that I spoke to whereby the kind of stepfather was having to travel kind of 2 or so hours to and from work every day, so 4 hours altogether, just to try and keep them afloat as a kind of blended family. So obviously all families I spoke to were having a really hard time, but I remember that specifically, that was a blended family's experience of that, and just trying to keep their heads above water.
Can I throw another quick question in there? I mean, what hope do you have that the 2-child limit will go?
I think that's one for Tom. Or
yeah.
It's a hard one. Well, I should say we have had one success in the campaign. So there was, as I think Kitty briefly mentioned, the original intention was to apply this policy retrospectively from February last year. So any family that had 3 or more children, regardless of when they were born, if they made a new claim for universal credit from last year, were going to be affected. And because of some of the pressure that we put on collectively, that policy was abolished by, I think, Amber Rudd back in January last year. So that was an encouragement. I think the broader policy, it's really hard to know. We are just plugging away and trying to build the evidence and as I say, build cross-party support. So we have got a group of MPs from all the major parties who are concerned about the policy. So yes, we're hopeful, but I don't think it's going to happen in the next budget.
Okay. So before we go on to any more last questions, we are running an online poll today, but Ruth can tell you more about that. Hi, Ruth.
Yeah, thank you, Shabnam. Yeah, so we have got one online poll, and we kind of struggled as organisers to think of one. But one thing that Tom kind of referenced right at the end of his presentation, but it also links back to what David was saying in his about being capped as a result of the pandemic, was around kind of the impact COVID has had, and maybe the ways in which COVID might have for some people challenged the logic of the 2-child limit. So what I'll do is I'll put up the poll, and I think what I do is I launch the poll, and then we just wait until, so read the question and then respond as you see fit, and then once we have a result, I end the poll. So and I'm afraid, I'm sorry panelists, we're not allowed to vote, so we have to stay impartial on this one. So yeah.
About to click.
Yeah, well, you can try. I don't think it will let you, but yeah. Just to say, I think you can also just nod. Kitty, can you nod if you can still hear me? You can still hear me while this is running. Yes, I was just going to say while this is running, it's nearly finished, but just that we will follow this all up. So I saw on the chat some people have asked for slides. We'll make sure to send an email. It might take a couple of days, to get it around, but we'll send an email with the slides. We'll also just kind of send the questions around panelists, so if people want to add anything to the questions that we didn't have time to answer, and then we can you know, we can do that. So that'll be fine. I'm going to end the poll now, just so, because people might just still be deliberating, or they might have popped out for a coffee or something. So if I end the poll, you should be able to, I can share the results. And what we see in the results is that to that question, 66% do think that COVID-19 has challenged the government line that everyone should plan for how many children they can afford. Interestingly, like 21% think no. So that's, you know, that's interesting. And also quite a large percent don't know the answer, or, you know, aren't sure of their stance on that. So that's that poll over. So Shabnam, I didn't know if you had any last things you wanted to say before.
Yeah, I've just got one final question for David. We started with David and we're going to finish with David. One question is that, and there's one for you here. I know you've been involved in work with others on universal credit to call for changes to the benefit system. What motivated you to get involved with this work, and how is it all going?
It seems to be going very well. What motivated me was just being in such a poor situation, mental health and things like that. I was starting to come out the other side with the mental health, and then boom, another thing. And I thought, any way I can help out. You know, I can share my experience. That's what I can do to hopefully help change things. And some of these fantastic people that have been on today, they can hopefully take that information and like Tom was saying, gather all that up and put pressure on the right people. I hope that's covered your question. I've maybe missed something.
Yeah. Can I just come in just to say, David, that I think you undersell yourself there a little bit. So, because I think actually you're doing a lot more than sharing your experiences, because actually, and even in your presentation, you were developing recommendations for change, and actually taking forward those ideas is really important. And that, you know, you have really, really good and important ideas for what needs to change. And actually, just to say that the work that David's doing under the kind of UCF, that is ongoing. So we've got you know, we've got a meeting, but that's specifically looking at universal credit in Northern Ireland, which operates slightly differently from how it does in other parts of the UK.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Ruth.
Any last questions? We have a couple of minutes. So anybody like to speak and ask a question?
I'll always speak, but I don't think anyone can ask it unless we ask each other. I think just to kind of wrap up and just say that I hope that you know, people have found like the different presentations helpful, and you know, from the research point of view, it was really important to hear from Tom and Camilla, and definitely like David's presentation was just brilliant, and will stay with us, I think, for a long time. I think we've got lots more. Oh, someone's just asked a question. Oh, this is a really to end. What's Erin's role? So why don't we end, Erin? That's your chance, your moment. So do you want to tell us what your role is?
I'm just here in the background trying to help out as best I can, and enjoying all the presentations. But I'm also involved with Kitty in doing some of the quantitative analysis. So
yeah. And we can't say, well, we won't say much, but to say that there is work ongoing on that in relation to the benefit cap that we're hoping to be able to share with you all very soon. And we do hope to do a separate webinar on that. Tom, were you raising your hand?
Could we just ask Lizzie to tell people how they can join in with the All Kids Count campaign to end the two-child limit if they would like to be part of that?
Yes, I think the most practical way is if you email me, and I'll put my email address in the chat and we can pick it up from there.
Shabnam, over to you.
Yeah, so I'd just like to say thank you for being part of this wonderful webinar. We've heard about some really powerful thoughts, some really powerful findings. Thank you to all the lovely speakers today, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, bye.
Thank you.